It is 4 o'clock, and I think I want to start. I know there's some more people still coming, but if we don't start, it's just going to tag it on, later. And so I think it's important that we get started right on time because it's a full evening. I'm excited to introduce to you Lonnie. He flew in from Idaho. He's living in Idaho right now. But for many years, he pastored over in Munster, Indiana. And so he's familiar with this area. And he's in and out of this area quite a bit. Lonnie serves as the executive director for Next Step Church Services. And what we have come to know that as TIPS. And he travels almost every weekend presenting these reports from the assessment, and then he helps churches in other areas, but then after these would secure under a TIPS contract with interim pastors, and there's all kinds of things that the ministry actually does, but he knows his stuff, and it's a pretty rapid fire night for us as he walks through. So let me pray, and then I'll surrender the mic to Lonnie. Father, we are grateful. First of all, just thank you for the fresh spirit of you being in the service this morning. Thank you for the voices that raised praise and honor to you. It was a special time to be together, and just thank you for that. As we look at data tonight, may we look deeper than just numbers and scores, but may we listen to your Spirit, what you want to say to WatersEdge tonight. Pray that you'd be with Lonnie, give him insight even as he speaks to what could begin a new day for WatersEdge. We thank you for the rich history of this congregation, and we anticipate as we think tonight of if we reimagined what the church would look like. So we pray for wisdom for that in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, here you are, brother.
All right, thanks, man. Well, hey, good afternoon. Man, it's good to be with you, and it's always good to be back in this part of the country. I was born and raised in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and pastored up in Michigan, and then the last assignment in Munster, Indiana, where I really thought that's where I'd retire. And I was having the time of my life, and God had blessed the ministry. It was 3 churches that merged together to form one church, called me to be the restart pastor of that congregation. Now, they said they wanted to be a new church, but they lied, just so you know. They really were looking to recapture the glory days of each of the congregations. One was 120 years old, and so they had a lot of history. And so when we started this whole process, I was wondering, what did I get myself into, right? But God blessed, and I thought that's where I would retire. There's no one more surprised I'm doing what I'm doing today than me. Because quite honestly, I was very content pastoring. We had a great staff of pastors that were working with us, and God had blessed the ministry. We were seeing about 100 people a year come to know Jesus, and it was just a fun time. And then Jesus showed up. I don't know if it's like this in your life, but every once in a while, he can make things pretty uncomfortable, right? To do things that push us outside of our limits, push us outside of what God might be asking us to do. And so people ask me where I'm from, and it depends on what season of life it is, right? Because, I spent a lot of time in Indiana, but I spent most of the time in Phoenix, Arizona. I was there for 21 years as living there, just having the time of our life. And then God called us to Idaho 2.5 years ago. Now, that call came through our daughter and our grandchildren, right? We're in the midst of transitioning into retirement over the next couple of years. And as we do that, our daughter and son-in-law called and said, hey, why don't you guys sell your house in Arizona and let's buy some property and we'll build a multi-generational home in Idaho. And so that's what we did. So I get to see my grandkids every day that I'm home. How cool is that? Right? I never imagined that's where I would be. So I can't say I'm from Idaho yet, right? Because I'm still learning what it means to live there. I was so naive. as a young person growing up, I didn't even know what Idaho was. It's like the Northwest was a foreign concept to me, and now I spend a lot of time there. And so that's kind of where I'm from. Now, for the last 25 years, it's hard to believe, but 25 years I've been doing this ministry, working with churches around the world. We have now served over 12,000 congregations in 35 different countries. It's been an amazing, amazing adventure. I made a commitment to Jesus when he asked me to do this, that as long as he would give me voice and opportunity, I would call his church back to his heart. Because Jesus said it this way, I have come to seek and to save those who are lost. And to you and I, he gave that mission when he left to go to be with the Father. And he said to you and I, go and make disciples of all nations, teaching them everything I've commanded you, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and then I will be with you always. Now, how many of us like the promise, I'll be with you always, right? Man, that's a cool promise. But there's a condition, and that's we need to be on mission with Jesus. Because in so many places across this great country of ours, there are churches that have become a gathering place for the believers without engaging lost and broken people in fresh and new ways. And it's never been more exciting and never been more challenging than it is right now to figure out how to be people of hope to a world that desperately needs hope. Right? And that's our call. He says, through the church, I want to make the manifold wisdom of God known to this generation. I'm the messenger tonight. You go ahead and complete the sentence. Because there will be times that hopefully we get challenged tonight. Hopefully somewhere along the way we get corrected a bit. Hopefully Jesus begins to reveal to us what he wants to see happen at WatersEdge Church. What does that look like in that process? So here's the good news. You do not have to remember everything I'm about to say, because you can't. Right? There's just too much information, too much data. You don't have to remember the details, because what's going to happen is after the report tonight, you're going to get a copy of that report in its entirety, either delivered to you by email or electronically in a PDF format, so you can read it on your phone, your computer, wherever that might look like. And if you don't know what a PDF is, let the office know and they'll print you a copy, right, in that process. Because we get it. Some people are very comfortable and some aren't. But we want everybody to have a copy that cares to, because it's important for you to think through the report, not just hear the heart of the report. So we have a 3-step process that we use in this whole delivery. Tonight is a presentation. Now, I get it because I've done these enough. Some people want to make it a conversation. That's for later. Tonight's a presentation of the data and the heart of the report so that you can hear the why before you get into the what, right? Because you get into a report and everybody looks at the recommendations, they look to the conclusions, and they either make a decision, I like them or I don't like them. But if you don't hear the heart of the report, those conclusions and recommendations aren't going to make a lot of sense. So tonight is about the heart. And then when you get the report, you get to digest it, right? You get to read it, you get to mark it up, you get to take your own notes, write your own questions, all of those kind of things. And then Eric will be leading you in a conversation about the report after you've had a chance to digest it. So tonight's a presentation, and then the digestion, and then the conversation, right? When I first started doing these 24 years ago, we used to do a Q&A time after the report. Oh, that was disastrous. Because people were just emotionally responding to something they either liked or didn't like. And so without thinking through all the data, so we understand we just need to take time to think. Now, I get it. Some people don't know what they think until they hear themselves say it, right? Anybody here ever had your mouth get ahead of your brain? Where you say something, you go, oh man, why did I say that? That's not what I meant in that process. In doing that, like my name's Lauren. Instead of Lori. You just get ahead of it, right? So that's how she introduced herself to me. I'm Lauren. No, I'm not. I'm Lori. So, and what that looks like. So anyway, sometimes we just got to let our minds catch up to our mouth sometimes, and we like to get our minds ahead of our mouth sometimes so that we're actually speaking with some intelligence and some understanding. So the report itself is about 89 pages long. So here's the good news. I'm not going to read 90 pages to you tonight. And all of God's people said, man, that'd be really boring in doing that. But when you get to the report, you'll see that about 45 pages of it is the meat and potatoes of the report. And then there's another 45 pages, that's the appendix, that includes a lot of definitions, includes some detail stuff, those kind of things that are part of the report. Right? So if you can master the first 45 pages, that's the piece you really want to digest. The other will help explain perhaps language or wording or something you've never heard before in that process. So here's what I want you to imagine for just a moment. I want you to imagine that you've gone through all these tests, all these things that we did, and you're coming in for the report of what it means, right? Anybody here ever go through medical tests, had to wait for results? You know, you go through the x-rays or the MRIs or the biopsies or whatever it is, and you have to wait for the results. Have you ever noticed when the results are good, the doctor just calls you and says, hey, everything's good. But if the doctor calls and says, hey, I need to see you, you know the results are going to be challenging. So whatever it's worth tonight, I'm here in person. So you just have to take that for whatever it's worth, because hopefully it'll be a little challenging as we go through that. So I want you to imagine all that's been done, and now we're coming to hear the results of what that looks like. I was delivering one of these reports in Arizona where I lived for a long time, and I got done with the reports on a Thursday night, and I made my way back home, and as I pulled into my driveway, I began to have pains in my chest like I never had before. I thought, man, what is going on? This is unusual. So I got in the house, and I went upstairs. My wife was already in bed, and I woke her up, and I said, Karen, I think you need to get up. Something's wrong. I think we need to go to the hospital. So she got up, and she got dressed, and she came downstairs, and by the time she came down, the pain had gone away. Thought, no big deal. Something I ate, some indigestion. Go ahead and go back to bed. It's okay. But then I'm sitting on the couch kind of wondering, right? What was that? Is it going to come back? Do I have to pay attention to it? And so I have a good friend of mine that I went to church with who's a medical doctor. Now, if you've ever had a plumber, electrician, a mechanic, a doctor, a dentist, anybody in the church, people are always asking for advice. If you have a skill, people are always saying, now, what do I need to do here? I've watched a lot of people talk to nurses and ask nurses things that the nurses just don't know in that process. But anyway, it's just nature. So Dan and I are really good friends, so I called him up. It's about 10 o'clock now, and I called him up, and I said, hey, Dan, here's what happened. What do you think I should do? Now, let's tell you how good of friends we were. He said, what, are you stupid? You need to go to the emergency room because better safe than... So I went back upstairs. I woke my wife up again. Not exactly the same attitude getting up this time, but I said, hey, listen, I just talked to Dan. Dan thinks we need to go to the emergency room. So she got up and she got dressed, and by the time she came down, the pain had come back with increased severity. I was having a heart attack. We ended up in the emergency room. We went through all the stuff that they do in the emergency room and all the testing and all that kind of stuff, and about 5:30 in the morning, the cardiologist came into the room and said, typically we do an angiogram now to find out what's going on, but we already know you're flunked. We know there's a problem, and so we're going to have to fix it. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to try to do it this way. If we can't do it with a stent, we'll have to do open heart surgery, do bypass, yada, yada, yada. So they went through all that. And he said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to bring you down to the cath lab, and we're going to go up through your wrist, and we're going to see what's going on. I said, wait a minute. I was a pastor for a lot of years, man. I've been in a lot of cath labs. I've prayed with a lot of people before they go through those procedures. It's through the groin. You know that, right? I'm thinking, can I see your license? Right? I'm thinking, I've never heard of that before. And he says, well, about 70% of patients, we can go up through the wrist. It makes recovery so much easier and so much faster. So we get down I don't know if you've ever been to a cath lab or not, but they don't knock you out. They just give you a medicine where you don't care. Right? You just kind of go through the motions of that. And so I'm sitting down there, and it's around Halloween time. And those doctors and nurses are talking about Halloween parties and costumes and where they're going to go and what they're going to do. And I'm thinking, pay attention. Man, you're in my heart for crying out loud. Talking about all the other stuff. Well, they were able to go in, and they discovered that the LAD, if you're familiar with the heart, it's typically called the widowmaker. When it blocks, you usually die. And it was 95% blocked. And so they were able to open it up, put a stent in. All was good. I went back up to the room. They released the pressure every couple hours. I went home that night. I thought heart attacks are not a big deal, right? Because you can just get used to those kind of things. I didn't feel real bad before. It was a little painful during, but now I felt really good. So, hey, heart attacks are not a big deal. It's kind of like churches that go through the idea of saying, God, what's next? It's a whole lot easier to do what's comfortable than it is to make any changes, right? We just do what we know how to do, even though it may not be as effective as it used to be, because we just get comfortable. And quite honestly, most of us value comfort over change, right? Doing things different than we've ever done them before. So I get home, and a week or so later, I had to go back into the cardiologist, and we went through all the blood work and all those kind of things there, and he told me that my cholesterol was too high. It was 235. You've got a history of heart disease in your family. You're going to have to eat better. You're going to have to exercise more unless you want to have another event. He gets done with his speech, and I finally said to him, I said, now, Doc, how many times have you given that speech? He said, well, hundreds of times. And I said, how many people actually changed their lifestyle because you gave them a speech? He said about 30%. 70% of cardiology patients will not make necessary life changes. They'll just have another event because they conclude heart attacks are not a big deal. And I thought to myself, Doc, you do the exact same thing I do night after night. I stand before churches and we talk about what it's going to mean and how can a church be as healthy as it possibly can be. And we start outlining a process, and churches sit there and nod their head and change nothing. Because change is hard, especially when it's significant, when we have to do things differently than we've ever done them before to work through that. So I left out of there going, I'm going to be one of the 30%. He said if I ate better, exercised more, I'd be healthier, and so I'm going to do this. So I left going, I'm going to be one of the 30%. So I started having single cheeseburgers instead of double cheeseburgers. I started having small fries instead of large fries, right? I started taking the stairs instead of the elevator. You know, I'm eating better, I'm exercising more, certainly it's going to help. So a few months later, I go back in, we go through all the blood work again and all those kind of things. I go into the office, and he says, now listen, you got to take this seriously. Your cholesterol is still the same. You've actually added 2 pounds. So you've got to take this seriously. I said, I did. Your program stinks. You said if I ate better and exercised more, I'd get healthier. It's kind of like churches. You know, you go through an assessment process thinking the assessment is the answer. The assessment is the beginning to the questions, right? This is not the solution. This is the beginning of a process. Now, I made a strategic mistake the second time. I took my wife with me. So she got to hear everything. And so now, not only do I have my own voice in my head, I've got my wife's voice in my head telling me that you got to take this seriously. You're going to have to make some changes. So I kept going. I spent a lot of time on the road, about 200 days a year on the road. So when you're on the road that much, it's hard to get into healthy habits, all of those kind of things, exercising, eating, all of that. And so I just kept delaying it. I kept delaying it. And finally, I came home from a trip in February one year. It's about a year, it had been a year and 3 or 4 months since the heart attack. And as I pulled it into our neighborhood, I noticed that I have 2 adult daughters, and both of their cars were in our driveway. It's like 9:30 at night on a Saturday night. Now, my wife's already been in bed for an hour. I mean, she grew up on the farm, man. 8:30 was bedtime. Man, nothing good happened after 8:30 in her mind in doing that. So I'm thinking, man, something's wrong. I mean, this is not good. So I walked in the house, and I realized quickly that they were having an intervention. Now, that's not what they called it, but that's what they did. They said, Dad, you got to take this seriously. We want you to be around for the grandkids, and so you got to take this thing seriously. You're going to have to make some lifestyle changes. I said, okay, I will. My youngest daughter said, no, Dad, you tell churches all the time, just because you want to be healthy will not make it so. You actually have to put a plan together to make it so. So you're going to have to come up with a plan. I said, okay, I will. He said, no, Dad, we're not leaving until you come up with a plan. I think they were serious. I think they just stayed all night doing that. So we started talking about it. My youngest daughter was a runner and a swimmer in high school. And she said, Dad, here's what I want you to do. I want you to run the P.F. Chang's marathon with me next January. In Phoenix, we had this thing called the P.F. Chang's Rock and Roll Marathon. Big deal. Thousands of people from all over the country would come to run this marathon. I said, how far is that? She said, 26. I said, you're nuts. Who in their right mind would run 26.2 miles for no reason? That made absolutely no sense to me. I take very seriously the proverb that says, foolish is the man that runs when no one's chasing him. You know, so what do you do with that, you know, in the process? But in a moment of weakness, because I was tired and I wanted to go to bed and they weren't going home, I finally said, okay, I will. Have you ever agreed to something but you weren't exactly sure what it was you agreed to? Kind of like having an assessment for the church. Whose idea was this anyway? Who thought it was a good idea to have Eric as an interim pastor, man? Right? Because we don't know exactly what you did, right? And agreeing to that. And so I agreed to something. I had no idea how much work was involved in making it a reality. Now, I knew nothing about running because I wasn't a runner. But I had a good friend of mine that I went to church with as well who was a runner. And I called him up and I said, hey, Kevin, I'm going to run the PF Chang's next January. Will you coach me? He said, I'll be glad to. Now, you all know sometimes we need an outside voice to speak truth into our lives so that we can make necessary changes to get healthy. That's part of this whole process of assessment. So I said, here's what you got to be able to do. You got to be able to run 20 minutes without stopping. Now, I don't know if you know how far 20 minutes is when you don't run, but it's like an eternity. Because I'm running in the block, I want a donut break, man. What do you got to keep running? He goes, I don't care how fast you do it. You just got to be able to run 20 minutes without stopping. So I started this thing, and I got through March, and finally, the 1st of April, I got up to the 20 minutes without stopping. I called him up, and I said, Kevin, I'm ready. He said, you ready for what? He goes, I'm ready to run the marathon. I said, you misunderstood. You're now ready to start training. It's kind of like churches that go through this process. They think that once they get a pastor, the work is done, right? But it's just beginning. It's not the end of that whole process. And so then he sends me a spreadsheet. Now, I don't know if you've ever prepared for a marathon, but it is a pain in the neck. I mean, I got short runs, long runs, core development. I got to eat differently. I got all kinds of things I got to do every day to get ready for this thing. And if you ever prepare for a marathon, you know how it is. You start with your short runs, and then you get up to your long run, and once a week, for me it was Saturday, I do a long run. And when you first start, it's not a big deal. It's a mile or two. Get up, do your long run, get up a couple minutes early, do that, and you're ready for the day. But when you start getting to 9 and 10 miles, do you know what time you got to get up in the morning? Man, I'm not rising up and calling that stupid alarm clock blessed. I wanted to call it a few other things, but that wasn't one of them because it was hard. It required discipline. It required work that I didn't even realize I was going to have to do. It's kind of like churches that go through an assessment process. When they get the results, it's the work just begins. And sometimes it's hard. Sometimes it's challenging in what that looks like. But I'd made a commitment to my daughter, so I stayed at this thing. I got through the summertime. I got into August, and then in September, I was up to about 10 miles for my long runs on Saturday, and my daughter called me and said, Dad, I can't run with you in January. I said, what do you mean? He goes, we're pregnant. Now, I'm grateful, man. There's nothing like being a grandpa, right, in the whole process. But inside, I'm going, thank you, Jesus, because I thought I was done, right? I mean, she's not doing it. I'm not doing it. Forget that. But then she said, Dad, I still want you to do it. We're going to come and cheer you on. So we went through that process, and finally in October, you have to sign up for the thing. I don't know if you've ever prepared for a marathon, but you have to pay them for your pain. You actually give them money to suffer. So I got ready to sign up. It asked me a couple of questions I wasn't quite ready to answer. One was, what's your pace? Slow. That wasn't an option. Because what happens in the big marathons, they put you in these pens based on your pace so that the slower runners don't slow down the faster runners. So I picked the very last one that I could do because I only had 2 goals in this thing. Finish without dying and finish before they close the finish line. Because I'm going to do it. I want the medallion, right, in that whole process. So we got to that place. Then it asked me the second question is, do you want to run the full marathon or the half marathon? Dude, I didn't even know that was an option. I'm thinking 13.1, 26 point. I'm already at 10. I'm pretty sure I can do 13 without dying. But I'm still not sure about the 26. So I chickened out and I signed up for the half marathon because it was cheaper too. Didn't cost as much to do that. So now, since then, I've run 4 half marathons and 2 full marathons. I still hate running. But man, I like being healthy. And I tell churches all the time, listen, you're in a marathon, you're not in a sprint. This isn't all going to be solved simply during an interim time when you have an interim pastor. It's going to be solved as you begin to say yes to Jesus, whatever Jesus asks you to do, whenever he asks you to do it. And I'm going to tell you, sometimes it'll be uncomfortable. Sometimes it may do things that you've never thought you would do. And almost always, it involves change. Little secret here, change is not a swear word. It's a part of anything that's living. The only thing not changing is something that's dead. And who wants to be a part of a dead church, right, in that process? So we try to begin to identify then in this assessment is where is the church? What's its current reality? So tonight what we're going to do is walk through these results and what that begins to look like. So there's a little outline that we're going to follow just so you kind of have an idea of where we're at. The first section we're going to talk about is church health. Now, for some of you, this may be new language and new concepts. Now, I know some of you, when Eric was your pastor previously, if you were here, went through a little bit of the church health stuff as well. But we're going to talk about the church health. We'll spend more time in that area than all the others combined. All right, so don't get nervous. Sometimes people get, man, we're going to be here till tomorrow. You won't be. We'll get you out, all right? But we are going to spend a little time talking about church health. Then we'll talk about the life cycle and where you all see yourself on the life cycle of the church. We'll spend just a moment talking about statistics, both attendance and giving, because that begins to reflect a little bit of where we are. Then we'll talk about leadership summary or leadership capacity and some of the personalities and some of the strengths and some of the weaknesses that we find in the leadership balance. Then we'll talk about all those surveys that you did and all the face-to-face interviews you did when Darla was here. And all of those, we'll summarize all that and put that all together for you as well. Then at the end, we'll spend a little time just talking about first impressions from a guest perspective. All right, so it's one Sunday, when Darla was here, it's just that first impression, right? And so it may not be all the time, but it was that particular Sunday, right, in doing that. So talk about first impressions. And then I'll refer to a part of the report called the Summary of Conclusions that you can read and begin to digest those conclusions. And then, of course, many people just want to know, what's this all mean, right, and the recommendations. All right, so here, I'm going to let you know right at the beginning of this that I will frustrate some of you tonight when it comes to recommendations. We will not spend as much time there as you would like, some of you. Not everybody. Some of you are going to be ready to go home by the time we get to that anyway. But those recommendations, what we try to do is to be specific enough to give direction, but general enough to allow for your fingerprints and the uniqueness of your church, right? So we're not here to tell you do A, B, and C. We're going to talk about here is the conclusion, now figure out the steps to get there. All right, so the recommendations are going to be general enough to allow for your fingerprints. And so I'll hit the highlights of those, but that will be part of the conversation that you will have as you move forward in those recommendations. So the first section we're going to talk about is church health. Several years ago now, while I was still pastoring, I partnered with an organization called Natural Church Development, NCD for short. It gets a little confusing. We call ourselves NCS for short. They're NCD. Totally unrelated, totally disconnected organizations. But one of the things that I really enjoyed when I read their research project was that Christian Swartz and I could have been brothers because he was a recovering church growth addict as I was. Because I grew up in a culture where everything was about numbers. The more people you got to show up, the more successful you were as a pastor. That's a crazy way to live, let me just tell you. Because sometimes on Monday I thought I was Jesus, and sometimes on Monday I thought I was the devil, depending on the attendance on Sunday, right? But I realized very quickly that numbers were not my responsibility. God decides the size of harvest. We don't get to choose that. We get to sow the seed. We get to cultivate the ground. We get to work the land. But the harvest is always determined by God, not by us. And so it got relieving. So the question became, instead of focusing on the fruit, people that actually attended and counting and all of those kind of things, what would happen if we'd focus on the root, on the foundation? Because we just believe this premise that if the foundation is healthy, the fruit will just be natural. And it will be actually genuine fruit, not fake fruit. Now, I get it because it was my generation when we got caught up in this church growth era where we created a generation of spectators to the show instead of participants in the mission. We got consumers of religion instead of disciples of Jesus. And so we can begin to say, now you know what happens. If the church is consumers, then if they don't like what they see, they find another show to go to, right? They just find someplace else to go so that they can get a show they like. And the problem is when you're all about the show, then you do stupid things as a leader to get people to come. I've done some of the dumbest things as a pastor. I mean, I rode a horse to church. I preached from the roof. I've had my tie cut off. I've had pies in the face, just crazy things to get people to show up. And they did until they got bored with the show, right? But that's not what Jesus called us to do. He didn't call us to raise up consumers of religion. He called us to raise up people who were disciples and followers of Jesus. So how do you measure that? That's why I got so intrigued by Christian Sports' research, because what they did is take a look at 1,000 churches in several different countries and say, is there a way to determine characteristics of a church that's producing disciples? And in that research project, they identified 8 essential areas that every church has to address and pay attention to if we're going to create disciples. Now, fast forward all these years, there's been over 87,000 church health surveys done since the beginning of that process. Over 42,000 of those in the United States alone. Now, you all know that's a miracle of God, right? That 42,000 churches in America would agree on anything. Because we're pretty convinced if it worked there, it won't work here, wherever there and here is. But one of the things I've learned now, after all these years of using the survey and thousands of them that we've done ourselves, this has the ability to cross all those lines, whether it's urban or suburban or whether it's rural or whether it's something else. All the ethnic groups, all the racial groups, all the classification groups, no matter what the sign is out front, no matter the size of the building, the size of the congregation, it crosses all of those and simply gives you a snapshot of your church and what that looks like. And we've done it now thousands of times. We've done over 3,000 of these surveys ourselves with the churches that we've worked with, and we found it to be incredibly accurate to give us a glimpse of the health of the church. It's kind of like the cholesterol level. It's kind of like the blood pressure. It's kind of like the blood work that you do to kind of give you an indication of where are we at. What does that look like? Now, here's the good news, and I'll just tell you the good news up front, that there are a lot of healthy indicators for your church. So don't think this is all about unhealth. What we do is simply help churches be more healthy than they currently are. Now, sometimes we start with churches that are very, very unhealthy and requires overhaul and significant work. Other times, like in your case, we have a good starting place that we're just going to talk about tweaking. We're just going to talk about what we can do to improve in those areas. So no matter where you are, there's always room for improvement, right? No matter how healthy you are as a person, there's always room for improvement. I mean, who among us couldn't, exercise a little more or lose a couple pounds or whatever it might be, right? There's always room for improvement. It's the way it is in the church. But knowing our starting place becomes really important. So what we did is a part of this assessment process is we had you complete a church health profile, and then we have numerical scores for each of the 8 characteristics. Now, here are your results for your church as you see yourself in these 8 characteristics. Now, for some of you, this may be new language, right? It may be something you haven't heard before, or you're kind of wondering, what do we even mean by that? But what this survey does is measure the adjective, right? So it doesn't measure whether you have leadership, it measures how empowered those leaders are. So it doesn't measure whether you have some kind of ministry, it's how gift-based is that ministry. So the adjective is what gets measured, and in our strategy, we're always talking about the adjective. How do we make worship more inspiring? How do we make small groups more holistic, etc.? All right, so we're walking through these 8 characteristics. Now, for you that are used to the standardized testing of our school systems, that's not what this is. All right? Your numbers simply represent your church's deviation from the mean. The mean of the profile is always kept at 50. This is your deviation from the mean, right? So this is the mean. This is how your church deviated. So it doesn't mean there are 60% churches that scored better than you. None of that, right? It's just your deviation. Now, 2 numbers to help you understand the scoring. The first number is 65. 65 is considered the health line. So any characteristic that is 65 or higher is considered healthy. Right? Now, here's the genius of the survey. Now, remember, 87,000 of them. When a church scores 65 or higher in all 8 characteristics, 98% of the time is a growing church. Because healthy things grow, that's what healthy things do. Now, how many of you were around, when was it, Eric? 2018? 2008. How many of you were around 2008 at the church here? All right? You did this survey back in 2008. You may not remember it, but you did it. And the results were phenomenal. All 8 characteristics were above 65. Many of them in the 70s. It was a healthy foundation, and as a result, you're experiencing growth. Not because growth was a focus, because the health produced growth. So since then to today, you can see that the numbers have begun to decline. Right, from where they're at. But they're not at the unhealthy range, which is 35. So 35 is considered unhealthy. So any characteristic that is 35 or below is going to require an overhaul to bring back to health. It's a cholesterol of 235. Just tweaking a couple things, a single cheeseburger or a small fry, is not going to do it. Right? It's going to have to be a little different. So depending on where the scores are will help us to understand how much work needs to be done. So there are 3 areas that are in red on the scale. These are what we call our priority areas that the church should work on because they're all 3 below the mean line of 50. And so I'm going to unpack those a little bit for you just so you understand the definition. So we talk about empowering leadership, gift-based ministry, and effective structures. So those are the 3 that become the highest priorities, because they determine your ministry capacity. It's not the things that are really high that determine the capacity, it's the lower things that determine capacity. So obviously we're talking about race. Now, y'all know, these can't be independently just looked at because they're all symbiotic. I mean, they all relate to each other. You think you're working on one thing and another score goes up in concert with it. But as far as focus goes, these 3 become the focus. So now what do we mean by these? So starting with the lowest one, which is empowering leadership, the survey takes that category and breaks it down into 4 subcategories to help you define it, and gives you a numerical score with the 35, 50, 65. Same scoring with 4 subcategories of what that looks like. So here's the empowering leadership subcategories. We talk about empowering others. In other words, when we ask somebody to do something, we trust them to do it, even if they would do it different than we would. Right? Anybody ever served on a committee where you were simply an idea committee and you had no authority? Man, that is a terrible place to be. And quite honestly, creative people will never join those kind of teams. If you can't have some authority to make decisions. So empowering means we trust people to not just do the work, but to implement the strategies and the recommendations. So they're empowered that way. And then we talk about leadership fit. That's making sure everybody's in the right place. Sometimes in the church, we volunteer because somebody twisted our arm, not because we really want to do something, right? Because, we can guilt people into doing all kinds of things. I know some people that will not come to church early because they're afraid of what they're going to get asked to do, right? Because I really don't want to do that. I remember I was guilty of that, as a pastor. One Sunday morning, we were getting ready for church, and I got a phone call from our 5th and 6th grade Sunday school teacher, and she said, I quit. I'm not going to teach anymore, and I'm not coming today. Right? And so now what do you do? Right? So you're the pastor, and you're trying to figure that all out, and so whoever happens to show up early, I think they make a great 5th and 6th grade Sunday school teacher. So you go up to them and you make them feel guilty. Listen, we got this group of 5th and 6th grade kids. I mean, they might go to hell if we don't have a good teacher for them today. Certainly you don't want them to go to hell, right? Right? And you can twist arms and you get somebody there and they go and teach the class because they like you and, they're willing to have their arm twisted, and 25 years later, they're still teaching that 5th and 6th grade class because we don't have good exit strategies. So part of this whole idea is making sure people are in the right places, serving in their areas of gift, calls, and passion. That's why in the recommendations, we combined empowering leadership and gift-based ministry because those two almost always go hand in hand, right? If people are serving in their areas of passion, then it's going to be a whole lot easier to empower them. And then we talk about delegation of ministry. Delegation of ministry simply means I'm willing to not have to do everything. Right? Sometimes we're guilty of that, right? Where I got to do everything. So, as long as you bow down and worship me, then I'll get everything done, right? But the idea here is to delegate ministry, is to get people to do things. Anybody heard the old adage, if you want a job done right? Right? Man, that is a death sentence in the church. And when you think about it, it's pretty prideful. Because I've learned whatever I can do, somebody else can do it better. Let's find people who can do it better and just release them. And not just get them to do a job, but to delegate responsibility to do it their way. Right? It may be different than you would have done it. And, there's a book, a leadership book, written by a guy by the name of Hans Fenzel. It's called The Top 10 Mistakes Leaders Make. And one of the top 10 leader mistakes is dirty delegation. We get people to do something as long as they do it our way, right? Instead of doing it differently. I remember I was working with a church in Texas, and we'd gone down and we'd spent a Saturday together coming up with strategy on how to delegate and empower more effectively. That was their area that they were working on. So we started at 9 o'clock in the morning. We finished about 3:30, just talking about strategies, came up with some great ideas about how we're going to do this more effectively, empower. You know how it is. You go through that whole thing, and we're having a pie social that night to share with the church the process and progress and some of the things we're going to do differently. And so we get done at 3:30, and the pastor's going to take me back to the motel for a little bit. And so he goes, before I go, I need to go down the fellowship hall. So we walk down the fellowship hall where the pie social is going to be, and all the tables are set up, all decorations are done. He starts rearranging the tables. Now, we just spent 6 hours talking about empowering people, and he starts rearranging the tables. I saw this as a coaching moment. I said, now, Pastor, who set all those tables up? Oh, we had some ladies that came in this morning and did that, got everything all set up. I said, are they going to come tonight? Oh, yeah, they come to everything. So what are they going to do when they come in and see all the tables rearranged? And more importantly, what are they going to do the next time you ask them to do something? You're just going to change it anyway. Do it yourself. Right? And what that looks like. Now, it wasn't a matter of what was going to work. Both ways would have worked just fine. And so I said, I tell you what, Pastor, let's put the tables back the way they were and go ahead and take me to the motel and let's stop and get a Coke. Because it's obvious you missed the last 6.5 hours. And so we got to clarify that and what that looks like. But I get it. I mean, sometimes, pastors' identity gets wrapped up in what they do, and they think they got to make themselves indispensable in that process. But far better to empower people and delegate and give away responsibility, right? And what that looks like. And so then the fourth area of empowering leadership is a compelling vision. You'll see as we go through the rest of this report that this is one of the areas that's going to be really important for you all, is to ask what's next. The vision driving is the vision of the past, not the vision forward. And so it's asking, what's next? God, where are you taking us? And creating a vision that moves us forward, doesn't just keep us where we are, right, in that whole process. And that becomes critical to be able to empower people to do that. Right? Now, the second area that we're also going to talk about in priorities is effective structures. Now, effective structures are the least spiritual of all 8 characteristics, right? Because it's the nuts and bolts stuff. It's how we get things done. It deals with how well do we plan, and do we have structures and systems in place to take us forward, or do our structures and systems keep us where we are? And so we're talking always about how do we improve our structures and our systems. And then we talk about innovation and managing change. And again, because all these scores are below 50, they become our priorities. Now, they're not overhaul areas. They're not down at 35, but they are some significant work that needs to be done to make sure that we embrace innovation and we manage change well. So here's the reality. There is the possibility in your church that there will be people that will resist change. They're not here tonight. They didn't come. They stayed home, right? Because there is that real possibility that we would value comfort over future forward leaning. Because comfort makes us feel good. how many times in the church have you said, why can't things just stay the way they are? But you all know nothing stays the same. Sometimes people say, why can't we go back the way we used to do it? I say, how far back do you want to go? You talking about first century? Get rid of your building, get rid of your air conditioning, get rid of your heating, get rid of your lights, because none of that existed back then. So people want to go back to when they came into the church, right? Because that was life transforming for them. And I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for a church that reached out to me many, many years ago now and cared for me where I was and dared to do some things differently. I'm a product of bus ministry. I'm a product of a church that dared to go buy a bunch of buses and get some bus captains, go knocking on kids in the inner city of Fort Wayne, Indiana, and invite them to church. Now, I never got on the bus because I was too cool, too old, but my brothers did. And more importantly, the bus captain became my dad's best friend. And 10 years later, brought him to Jesus, which is a radical transformation that happened. Now, I'm grateful for a church that dared to do that, invest that kind of money in buses and all of those kind of things. But I'm telling you today, if you show up in my neighborhood with a bus to pick up kids, to take them places they don't know, to be with people you don't know, to teach them what you don't even understand, they'll arrest you, I'm telling you right now. It's just weird. I mean, I'm grateful that it worked, but man, it's just a weird time right now. Who's going to do that? Right? And I'm not talking about providing transportation for people that need transportation. I'm talking about reaching unchurched kids without connecting to their parents. Do you know how many parents sent their kids to churches? That's weird. I think about it now. I'm like, that's just weird because they didn't know anything about it. My dad was as unchurched could be. He was an alcoholic, and so he wasn't connected to a church ever in his whole life until he got saved. But he sent my brothers on a bus to a church. I thought it was a cult at the beginning. Nazarene, that sounds weird, right? And what that looks like. But anyway, it's the whole idea of embracing God's next, whatever that looks like. And then we talk about structures for effective leadership. Now, what do we mean by that? Structures for effective leadership is we have a plan in place to raise up and develop a new generation of leaders. We're always looking for leaders that have potential to become leaders. So we intentionally pour into them. We intentionally develop them. We spend time with them and what that looks like. And that starts as young as 14 or 15 years old. Because there's a lot of young people that have potential leadership. I'm grateful today for a youth pastor that saw something in me that I didn't see in myself and began to push the envelope and began to do those kind of things because he saw potential, not reality, because there was no reality at that point. But he saw the potential. Help us to look at people with potential and what God can do in their lives. That's leadership development. And doing that. All right, so I told you I'm going to spend more time in those three because those become priorities in our recommendations, right, and what that looks like. The third one is gift-based ministry, and as I mentioned, almost always goes hand in hand with empowering leadership. Now, gift-based ministry means I know and understand the gifts that God's given to me, and I understand how to use them in the ministry and the body life of the church, and I feel equipped and supported to do what I'm being asked to do. So it's equipping, it's supporting, it's giving people the resources, making sure they have the understanding that they need. And so here, what we look for is this support and significance and integrating, because those are the ones below 50, and say, okay, how do we solve that, right? And so we talk about helping people understand their gifts, their passions, and their call. It's not just spiritual gifts test. I mean, how many times can we take spiritual gifts test? I mean, that's not just about that. It's helping people know their passions. It's helping people discern God's call. So can you imagine if in your church everybody was doing what they're gifted, called, and passionate about and nothing else? Man, the church would never lack for energy. So here's a very simple premise we use. We believe there should be no unemployed Christians at WatersEdge Church. Everybody ought to be engaged according to their gifts, calls, and passions. Now, we also believe that if you're doing something you're not gifted to do, you're not called to do, you're not passionate about, you got to stop it. I said that one night, lady back raised her hand. Are you serious? She goes, I quit. She goes, I've been the missionary coordinator around this church for the last 2 years. I hate it. I said, I think it's a good idea. I think I got to quit. Because chances are, if that's taking all your energy, you're not doing what God's called you to do anyway. Right? You can always tell the difference. I did a lot of youth ministry in the early days, and students. I always had a very simple philosophy. If you don't like teenagers, don't work with them. Right? I mean, you got to love them because, and they do weird things sometimes. I mean, it's just part of growing up. You did weird things when you were there, too. Sometimes we get that holier than that. Oh, I never did that. I never snuck a carrot up my nose or in my ear or whatever it might be. We all have been a part of that, right? And so you got to like teenagers. Same thing with children's ministry or women's ministry or whatever the ministry might be. You got to like what you're doing. And if you don't like what you're doing, go ahead and stop. Because chances are you're either taking somebody else's job or the church is doing something they shouldn't be doing. Because God has put together in this church everybody he needs to do what he desires for the church to do in gift-based ministry. All right, so those three become the priorities. Now, when we get to the next ones, I'm going to go through these pretty rapidly because they're above the 50. They don't become priorities, but there are a couple of subcategories that you'll want to pay attention to, and we do that in the report as well. So the next one we talk about is need-oriented evangelism. Need-oriented evangelism deals with this whole idea. Do we have a plan in place to reach lost and broken people? Are we being effective at reaching lost and broken people? And am I committed personally to investing in lost and broken people? And then we talk about being seeker sensitive. It's one of the hardest challenges for a lot of churches is because today people belong before they believe. See, it used to be you had confrontational evangelism, right? I mean, whatever that looked like for you, the 4 spiritual laws, the Romans Road, Kennedy's plan, whatever you'd learned to do in confrontation. First person I ever led to Jesus was a single mom on a Thursday night. I was 19 years old. I knocked on this little trailer door and I said, if you died tonight, would you go to heaven? And if you stood before Jesus and said, why should I let you in? What would you say? That's how the conversation started. I didn't know her. She didn't know me. There was 2 other guys on the porch with me. I'm thinking to myself, whose idea was this? Can you imagine doing that today? 7:30 on a Thursday night, knocking on somebody's door. You may not make it off the parking lot, or off the porch, just so you know. But it was a different era. I mean, she accepted Christ that night, and it was exciting and all those kind of things. But what happened is people would believe, and then they'd belong. They'd join a church. Today, people belong before they believe. And you know what happens when somebody starts attending your church that's not a believer? They don't act like you, smell like you, talk like you, or have the same values you do. And if we're not careful, we can judge them away from Jesus instead of loving them to Jesus who can transform hearts and lives. Y'all know there's nobody in this room that's ever transformed anybody's life. That's the work of the Holy Spirit. All we can do is love people to Jesus and let Jesus do the transforming. But man, sometimes if we're not careful, we can judge people right out of a relationship with Jesus. Because every church has its own little personal biases, their own little things. I'll accept this sin, but not that sin. You know, we can be sensitive to somebody that's a gossip, but man, if they're a murderer or they're a child molester or they're a whatever, we begin, oh yeah, not here. But you all know it's on the same list, right? But there's some sins that are okay and some sins that we just get us all riled up. But the problem is all sin in God's eyes. He's calling you and I to love sinners to Jesus. It's amazing to me that sometimes the church is surprised when sinners act like sinners. Right? I mean, what do you expect? And that's what we talk about here because that's the lower area. It's one of those areas to say, okay, how do we make sure we create a welcoming environment that loves people to Jesus so that Jesus can transform hearts and lives? To be sensitive to seekers, that means we create space for people to actually seek. Now, you all know their pace is going to be different than your pace and how long it takes. And sometimes it can get really tricky to kind of navigate those waters and what that looks like. And then the next area we talk about is loving relationships. Again, loving relationships deals with not just being friendly, because every church in America is friendly. Just ask people, they'll tell you. We're not talking about that. We're talking about a climate where people can go deeper in their relationships, where people feel affirmed and encouraged, where there's an atmosphere of joy and acceptance, where relationships go deep and conflict is resolved in healthy ways. Hey, here's the good news for your church. Y'all like each other. I mean, who wants to go to a church where we don't like each other? That's not fun. I've been to that church, just so you know. It's not a fun place to be. But what we talk about here is, okay, how do we make sure that there are pathways for people that are not as connected to become connected, right? How do we make sure that people aren't on the outside, but that we begin to incorporate them into the body life of the church? Because you all know, one of the easiest places to be fake is Sunday morning, because everybody can be good for an hour. It doesn't take much effort. Just ask people, how you doing? Good, good, good. Y'all know sometimes when you come to church, you're not good. Sometimes this has been a tough week. Sometimes you're going through some tough stuff. Because sometimes life just stinks. And sometimes we just need to come to a place where people can put their arms around us and love us to Jesus and just love on us and affirm us, encourage us, even in the midst of our stuff. Because all of us have different stuff. Right? If we took time today and start telling the story, we talk about some of the stuff that you've all had to deal with, stuff you've had to work through. And the church ought to be one of the places that we are affirmed and encouraged, that we're accepted, and it's a joyful atmosphere, even in the midst of our pain. That's the body of Christ, being the body of Christ. When I was a pastor, I used to always tell the congregation that I served, every Sunday, you get a chance to be a miracle in somebody's life. There's going to be somebody come through the doors of our church today that are hurting, that's questioning, that's going through some relationship challenges or financial challenges or whatever it might be. And you, as the body of Christ, get a chance to be a miracle to somebody's life today. To put an arm around, to pray for somebody, to encourage them. It's amazing where a word rightly spoken can be a source of encouragement and affirmation for somebody that's hurting. Man, God, help us to be sensitive, right? That's what we talk about in this love and relationship piece in doing that. And then we talk about passion spirituality. Passion spirituality deals with the whole idea of my own walk with Jesus. Am I experiencing God on a regular basis? Am I passionate about the church? Am I passionate for my own devotional life? Am I connected spiritually with other people? In other words, is there somebody that I can call and cry with and know I'm going to be loved? Because every one of us need people in our lives that know us well and love us still. Right? Because, sometimes if you really knew me, you wouldn't like me very much because sometimes I'm not very likable, right? It's the same thing with all of us. We all need people that know us well and love us still, right? And what that looks like. That's what we're talking about here in this idea of passionate spirituality, being connected spiritually with other people. Now, obviously, when a church goes through a transition period, the passion for the church has a tendency to decline a bit anyway. And it's just a natural part of the transition process. But we do want to talk about raising the level of passion for the church, because what you're passionate about, you just support. You invite people to. You participate in. You're sacrificing for, right? That thing that you're passionate about. Because you all know passion is just incredibly important in our lives. And what we get passionate about, we always do, right? And to figure that out. So passion for the church becomes important. And then we talk about holistic small groups. Now, here's a little challenge for you. This does not measure participation in small groups, right? This measures a existing group, how holistic people that are in that group perceive it to be, right? So it's not a matter of taking a look at how many people are involved, because quite honestly, it's probably one of the challenge areas is getting people engaged in small groups beyond worship, right? And paying attention to that. So here we're talking about spiritual community, multiplication, integrating new people, and the groups being relevant to life. In other words, they're actually answering questions that people have and what that looks like. Right? Again, because we can't work on everything during an interim time, we're going to work on the priorities, but there are a couple of things that you just want to pay attention to, right? And what that looks like. Then we talk about inspiring worship. Hey, here's the good news. This is your highest score. Y'all like worshiping together. You like each other, you like Jesus, and you like worshiping together. Woo-hoo! That's a good thing, right? And who wants to go to a church where you don't even like worshiping together? I mean, I was at a church a couple months ago, and they were yelling at each other on Sunday morning. Stand up, yelling, screaming, not liking each other. I'm thinking to myself, who wants to go to a church like that? Right? Good news is you got a church that loves each other, you got a church that really cares about one another, and a church that enjoys worshiping together. So in worship, we talk about being transformative. It's helping me to live out my walk with Jesus. We talk about being guest-friendly or visitor-friendly. We talk about anticipation for that. And we talk about the preaching that is connecting. So again, because this is your highest score, which is at 55, is there room for improvement? Certainly, but that's not one of the priorities during the transition time. It will need to be as you kind of continue to work through that, but not at this point. So for all of you that are keeping score, that's 32 scores we just reviewed. I know all of you knew that, right? And so what we do is we take those 32 scores, we break them down into 5 highest, 5 lowest, just to help us identify strengths. So your 5 highest scores were in the area of personal evangelism, in other words, a desire to reach lost and broken people, spiritual connection, conflict resolution, integrating new people, and relevance of message were the things that were the 5 highest. Again, you'll see the categories that those apply to. Now, for us, when we start talking about recommendations, we address the lower scores, which in this area is delegating ministry, structures and systems, leadership fit, support for ministry, and being seeker sensitive. So obviously, when we start talking about our recommendations, we're going to address those areas because those become the priorities. So that's the church health piece. I told you that's the longest of all of them combined, right? Because here's what we do in the rest of the assessment. We look at the other results and say, does those results confirm and affirm those scores, or are there anomalies? Are there some things that just are different from the rest of the assessment? Your story is pretty consistent throughout the entire assessment. So the second thing we looked at was what's called life cycle. And what we did is we gave you a survey, and we take each of the stages of the life cycle. We've developed some questions that you answered. You gave them a score of 1 to 5. And in each of those stages, those questions, here were your scores and the overall average of what that looked like. So you talk about birth to death. There's a numerical score. Now, they'll mean more as I explain what they mean. So let's just take a moment and talk about the 1s to 2s. A score of 1 to 2 means this does not describe us at all. It's not where we are, right? So the duh moment of the night, ready for it? You weren't just born, right? Duh, right? We're not a church plant. We're not new. We've been around for a while. So then we look at the 2s to 3s, which means some of those characteristics are either left over or some that are starting to show up in that portion of the life cycle. And so you have the 2s to 3s. Here were your scores. There are some growth characteristics that are left over, and there's some decline and dropout that are beginning to show up, and even some death characteristics that are beginning to show up in that process. So then we said, okay, if you take a look at the 3s or close to 3 to 5s, that's where the church is most likely in the life cycle right now. Again, because it's a movement, we would say, okay, the church sees itself as having moved through the maturity stage and is now beginning the plateau stage of the life cycle. Now, this is probably the most dangerous time for a church because it's the most comfortable. It's the sense of what we're doing is working. I kind of like it. I don't want to change anything. It's all good, and you get comfortable, right, in the middle of that. And that's where a lot of churches, when they're in that maturity to plateau stage, where they begin to hang out and they wonder, why do we need to do anything different? Because what we've done has worked. Until we realize that there are some things that are beginning to show up that if we don't address now, you all know what it is. When you get on the downward side of the life cycle, negative momentum takes over pretty rapidly. You ever tried to stop a rock rolling downhill? And it's hard. And what that looks like. Now, here's what we've learned. This is not chronological, all right? This has nothing to do with age. It has to do with attitude. Our attitude determines where we're at in life cycle, not a chronological age thing. But what we've learned is you can change from that maturity plateau stage back to the growth zone, but it will have to be done intentionally. It doesn't just happen. If we just continue to do what we've always done, you'll end up moving through maturity, you'll get into decline and drop out and eventually death. Now, who knows how long that will take, because as long as you have resources, you can continue to extend the life cycle. But if you want to move back into the growth zone, this is the most opportune time to do that. but it's also the most challenging time to do that because you have to overcome comfort in order to move back into a growth zone, right? Right now, there is a temptation throughout the entire assessment to show that the church has become inward focused as opposed to outward focused. And that's just natural because you want to protect the resources, right? You want to keep things the way we're comfortable with. There's just that natural tendency that happens. To move back into the growth zone will require us to be a little bit uncomfortable. It's going to require us to have to say, God, what's next in that process? So then we also did a bit of a statistical review just to kind of help us understand. If we were to look at your church health scores, we would say the church is probably closer to plateau than you want to admit and probably moving towards decline. So we would put it on the other side of the life cycle based on the church health scores. And certainly when you take a look at the statistics, it tells us why we put it on this side, right? Because here's the attendance statistics for the church of the last 10 or 11 years. So from 2014, you'll see from 2014 to 2019, the church was pretty stable, a couple of spikes, but pretty plateaued in attendance and what that looked like. 2021 and 22, the church saw a pretty significant decline. Now, that's during the pandemic and all those kind of things that happened that impacted it. But it's more than pandemic driven and what that looks like. So now, the post-pandemic, when the churches began to gather together, you were at the smallest that you'd been in over the last 11 years. Now, since then, there's been a bit of a jump back, so the recovery was a little longer here than in some churches we work with during the pandemic, right? So some churches bounce right back, some never bounce back, and what that looks like. Your bounce back was a year longer than a lot of churches in the post-pandemic bounce back. So, and part of it is because of the state you're in, and so the more restrictive natures and all those kind of things that were just a part of it in doing that. But what happened, though, you had the bounce back that put you still smaller than you were pre-pandemic, but now there's been a bit of a decline again, which would indicate that there's some things that you have to pay attention to if you want to move back into the growth zone. You know, right now it's comfortable. We can do church with the people we have. We can have fun. We can, we like each other. We like worship. We can serve each other, and it's very easy to just keep doing what you've done. But if you want to move back to a healthy spot of growth, it's going to require some things to be done differently, and what that looks like. So then we also, just to help us understand the commitment level to the church, we took a look at finances. So in your overall giving to the church, you'll see that the church followed the same kind of pattern of growth and plateau there. You did not follow the decline in attendance with your giving. The giving actually remained stronger than your attendance. Now, almost every church had some bit of a either stay the same or increase in the first year of the pandemic because people wanted to make sure there was a church to go back to. So they were very conscious about getting their money in. But oftentimes, there was a bit of a decline after the first year in that giving. Yours continued to go up. And even with the recent attendance dip, the giving has remained pretty strong. So for a church your size, the giving is incredibly strong. There's a high level of financial commitment to the church that is significant. And I always like to tell churches, listen, to whom much has been given, much is required, right? You have a responsibility then to be good stewards of what God's allowed you to continue to have, even though the numbers are a little less than they used to be as far as attendance goes. So you take a look at the church health scores, you take a look at the statistics, you take a look at the life cycle. They say a very similar story and what that looks like. So if we're talking about moving forward, part of what we did is also what we call leadership capacity or leadership balance. Now, if you're on the leadership team, elders or staff or whatever it might be, this is not a criticism. This is just identifying the balance, what that looks like. So what we did in taking a look at the leadership profile, we looked at a couple different things. The first thing we looked at was leadership style, because every leader has a style, right? So that style is not something you choose, it's just something you are, right? And what that begins to look like. So what we do is identify several different styles. The first style that we talk about is a pioneering style. Pioneers are the risk takers. Pioneers are the why not people, right? Every church that does anything different always has to have some why not people. Somebody comes with an idea, why not? But every church has some why people too. Why are we going to do that? Right? So we get that. But pioneers, there are two that are on the current leadership team. Now, you'll see these numbers may add up to more leaders than you have because some people have more than one style, right? And what that looks like. You have two that are strategic leaders. Strategic leaders take the idea of the pioneers and make them a reality, right? So they're the ones that put plans together. Then you have one who has a management style of leadership. Managers manage well what is. They're not the risk takers, they're not the forward people. They'd rather keep things the way they are. You have two that are team. Those are the collaborators. They're the ones that like to collaborate together and come up with a solution and an idea. And then you have zero leaders that are pastoral in leadership style. Now, this is important because pastoral leaders are people. They're the ones that are always concerned about everybody. They want to make sure everybody's aware. They want to help understand the why in that process. And when you don't have a pastoral leaders, sometimes people can feel like they're being run over, or they're not included in the conversation, or they're not included in the communication of what that looks like, because you just don't have those kind of folk that are paying attention to that. And you have one that's an encouraging leader. Encouraging leaders are the cheerleaders. They're the ones that make things happen in that process. So you'll see most of the leadership styles are represented. There's not one that's over the top strength, but there is one glaring weakness, and that is the area of helping people come along in the process and doing that. Then we took a look at the elders board. We asked, how well do you work together? How well do you function together? We gave you several characteristics. The score, the overall effective score, was 33.92, and scores of 31 to 40 represent an above average board in feelings of effectiveness, that they're working well together. We always pay attention to that because sometimes if they're not working well together, we may have to have a change, right? Because they're not functioning. That's not the case here in doing that. Then we took a look at spiritual gifts, just to help you understand the spiritual gifts that are represented on the team. The gifts that are most represented were encouragement, mercy, administration, service, discernment, hospitality, and faith. They're the ones that were most represented. The gifts not as well represented were teaching, exhortation, giving, evangelism, prophecy, shepherding, leadership, and apostle. Now, what does that all mean? If you take a look at the profile. Now, again, this is not a criticism. You are who you are. As God wired you. We're talking about balance. So the current leadership team is designed fairly well to give reassurance and support, to feel compassion for the hurting, to manage people and resources, to meet needs, perceive truth from God's word, make people feel welcomed, and trust God to act on his promises. That's good, right? I mean, that's the kind of people you want in doing that. Again, balance is the key because that team may struggle with clearly explaining and applying God's word to unbelievers, promoting Christian maturity, motivating and directing people in ministry, and starting and overseeing new ministries. Now, you'll notice, and you may not, but we do, that the weaker areas of your church health scores and the weaker areas that y'all talked about are the very gifts that are not represented well on your leadership team. So again, we're going back to balance. We're not criticizing because you are who you are. We want to make sure we have balance, right? So you've got to have some folk that are going to help in these areas that we are the weakest in, which is that whole area of helping people find their place, discipleship, commitment to discipleship, starting overseeing new ministries, discovering what's next. So we ought not be surprised that that's just not a normal part of that conversation because doesn't match up to their gifts. Then the last one we took a look at was personality. Now, every time I get here, I got to say, move on. Don't spend time here. Just kind of share the results and move on, right? All of my graduate work is in counseling. And so I've done tons of marriage counseling, done lots and lots of youth counseling and student counseling over the years. And I try to read people. It's a curse. Man, every time I meet somebody, what's their personality? How do they play out of that? What kind of conversations we have? Because you all know, if you understand the personality, it's a whole lot easier to relate and connect and know how to talk to a person. Like I know some people, if I'm direct, man, they'll be offended and cry for the next 2 days. And others, if I don't cut through the stuff and tell you what we mean, they'll get aggravated and frustrated, right? So we got to find that balance because personalities are critical. Now, it doesn't matter what profile you can use. Lots of profiles out there. Some of you are familiar with the DISC, the dominant, the influencer, steady, compliant. Some may be familiar with the animals, the golden retriever, the otter, the lion, the beaver kind of personalities. Some people like other things, strength finders or whatever it might be, that people have different personalities and types and what that looks like. Somebody just did a Star Wars character one on Star Wars characters and personalities and what that looks like. Somebody just did another one on Bible characters. There's all kinds of them out there. There are 4 basic personality types, no matter what label you put on it. Now, we choose to use Litauer's language, which has been around for a while, and it's common to most people. Choleric, melancholy, phlegmatic, sanguine, right? And those personality types. Now, people say, well, why is that one better? I'm going to say it's better. We just use it. And the reason we use it is because we have a partnership and a licensing fee that we pay to them so that we can do it for church leaders for free, right? So we use it. It gives you a good glimpse as to what that looks like. So using their language, just let me give you a summary real quick. You have the cleric. Clerics are the bosses. They think they're always right. Just ask them. They'll tell you, right? They are quick to make decisions. They are dying tonight because this meeting is way too long, right? Just cut through the stuff. Tell me what needs to happen. Let's move on, right? In doing that. And they're the kind of people you give an assessment report to. They read the recommendations, and that's it. Cut through the stuff, right? Bottom line. And then you have the sanguines. Sanguines are the creative, energetic, life of the party, fun to be around. They don't care how long meetings go as long as we're having fun, right? And almost always involves food, right? So they just want to have a good time in that process. I'm thinking I should have came next Sunday so I could have the chili. But anyway, what that looks like. So you have the sanguines. And then you have the melancholies. Melancholies are the detail people. They're the perfectionist. They can tell you why something won't work without even thinking about it. I mean, they can come up, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? What about this? What about that? They're just those kind of folk. It just is natural for them. Then you have the phlegmatics. Phlegmatics are the peacemakers. Their whole theme in life is, can't we just all get along? Let's just join hands and sing Kumbaya one more time, right? Because they value peace over everything and what that looks like. And so you got those 4 basic personality types, and you all know if you've got a phlegmatic and you try to push them too fast, they're not going to go with you if they think somebody's going to be offended. And if you haven't thought through the details, melancholies will always vote no in what what that looks like. So you just got to understand different personalities, right, and what that looks like. So I can tell you right now, if I knew your personality and knew your spouse's personality, I could tell you what your conversations at home are like. Because it's all personality. It's how we work, right? I am a choleric. My wife is a melancholy. She is a detailed perfectionist in every way. Matter of fact, the first 3 years of our marriage, I tried to fix her. I thought she was broke because she was always telling me why I couldn't do things, right, in that whole process. But just so you know, that didn't work out so well. But now 45 plus years later, we've learned that we complement each other. Because quite honestly, she has saved me from a lot of mistakes, and I've pushed her to do things she would have never done before in her own personality. It's just a matter of balance. It's not right or wrong. So here's the makeup of your current leadership team and personality using that language. You have 1 sanguine, you have 2 clerics, 2 melancholies, and 2 phlegmatics. Now for us, we look at the average score because that tells us how strong those personalities are within the team. So if I were simply to look at your strength, I would say your team is really good at melancholy, phlegmatic personalities, details and people they care about and what that looks like. You do have some that want to make decisions quicker than others in that process. And you have 1 sanguine, but it's a very a low sanguine score. So you would, again, go back to creativity, not having that energetic kind of stuff. That's, sanguines, they come up with ideas without even thinking about it. Now, they may not remember them next month, but they'll just come up with ideas, right, and that whole process. And you need a good balance of those folk in order for us to achieve God's next. So there is a temptation, just based on the leadership structure, to have long meetings, lots of discussion, and slow to make good decisions, right? It just takes too long for some people. Others, you're going too fast, right, in that process. So it's important to know and to understand the personalities. Uh-oh. I got to get this plugged in here. Hold on just a second. There we go. My battery was dying. I forgot to plug it in. It's kind of like the church. Yeah. You forget to get plugged into the power, you get in trouble, right? Trying to do it your own self and doing that. So that's the personalities. Now, the next area we talk about is all those surveys that you filled out. Written surveys, face-to-face things, all those questions. We gave you some open-ended questions, lots of comments. Took you longer than you wanted to, and you wanted to rewrite them and all those kind of things. We get it. We've been doing this a long time, and what that looks like. We get a little chuckle out of every time we get these back because they want to rewrite our questions. So they'll leave editorial notes on the questions. It's like, great. I'm glad they felt better. It's not going to change anything, but I'm glad they felt better to be able to do that. But anyway, all the surveys. So the first thing we did is to get a profile of who completed, who participated in this portion. So there's several portions of the assessment, but this portion, we had 38 written surveys that were turned in. We had 24 face-to-face interviews. There were 43 different people that took part in this portion of the assessment. Right, so it gives you an idea. It's about 40% or so of the adult attendance. So it's a good representation. Our goal is always 30%. Right, that's what our target is. Whenever we hit that goal or higher, we're pretty confident in the results and what that means. So then we also want to get an idea of the age breakdown. We've done this enough to know. We get to this portion, and people, well, it's just the old people that filled it out, or it's just the young people that filled it out, right? So we're always looking for balance and what that looks like. We're really balanced here in those that participated in the survey. You had a few people that were under that 35 age. Most people were in that what we call the middle age adult population, which is great. I mean, it's a good representation of what's here tonight and a good representation of the church, right, and what that begins to look like. Then we also did a gender breakdown to make sure we had both male and female perspectives. In that process, we had 62% female, 38% male. That's pretty common. 60-40 is our average because guys don't like to fill stuff out, especially if it's an open-ended question where they got to actually write stuff down. That takes way too long for many people to do that. And then we asked the question, how long have you been a Christian? Because this becomes really important. How long have you been a Christ follower? Now, we didn't define that for anybody. We just asked how long you've been a Christ follower. In doing that, 70% have been Christians longer than 26 years. Now, this is significant because there were so many people that were in their 30s and 40s that took part in the survey, or 40s and 50s, that took part, which means most folk have been Christians a really long time. Now, there have been a little evangelism, happening, but very small numbers, right, and what that looks like. So then we said, okay, how long have you attended this church? Right? So people have been Christians a long time, right? And so how long have you attended this church in that process? Here's what we discovered. 35% have been here less than 5 years. That's a third of the congregation that are relatively new. And you got 10%, 8, 18, 13. You can see the results there. Now, why is that important for us? Well, if 70% have been Christians a long time, the current structure of the church is designed well to reach people that are 40 and over who are already established in their faith. That's the current DNA of the church. That's who you're most likely to reach. Now that means if you want to reach people that are unchurched or lost and broken, things are probably going to need to change, right? Because what got you here won't get you there without some adjustments, right? I'm trying to figure that out and what that begins to look like. Then we also want to do a little bit of a kind of a marital status, only because we're trying to figure out, are we ministering to a traditional family, singles, what does that look like in the church? So you see here that 85% were married. You see a little bit of single, divorced, widowed. But that just simply tells us the church is doing well to reach the traditional family. Right? That's your current reality. Why is that important? Well, let's say you decided you wanted to focus on single-parent households to realize that your current structure has done well to minister to established families, not to that, right? So it's going to affect you. I'm not saying that should be your ministry focus group, but if it were, you need to know that the change is probably going to be pretty significant, of what that would take to be able to do that. Then we talk about the community profile. So what we did, we asked you how far you drove to come to church, right? And so we took all that out and got an average where the majority of people lived, and we we identified that as what we call the ministry impact area. So for you, the vast majority of people drive less than 6 miles to come to church. Now, there's some of the exceptions. You know, you got some people that are driving a little farther and all that kind of stuff, but the majority are in that 6-mile radius. So part of what we did, and you'll see this in the assessment, there's several pages of this, a demographical profile that we provided for you for that area. Now, you all know demographics are only as good as the census data that it's pulled from, right? So if the census data is not good, the results aren't going to be good, right, in that process. Now, you'll see when you get the report, and if you happen to go to that part in the appendix where this report, a lot more information is found, you're going to see that this comes from the Church of the Nazarene. The Church of the Nazarene has the best research department of any group that we work with. And because of our partnership with them, they allow us to do it for all churches for free. So you can go to any part of your community. If you want to know who lives in your neighborhood, you can go to that site and you can figure it out. It's an incredible gift that they give to the church. It's amazing. No other group has it. And so it is one of those things. So anyway, here's that 6-mile radius, 221,000 people. Now, is it 225? Is it 250? I don't know. What we look for is trending, right, and what that looks like. A lot of people live within 6 miles of the church. The past 5-year population change has been pretty stagnant, pretty even. Now, there may be some growth, but some lessening as well. And again, because the data is only as good as the last census, things can change pretty dramatically. I was just in Springfield, Ohio, delivering a report a week ago, and their demographics don't match their profile at all because of the Haitian immigration that's happened in that town, where they've got over 50,000 immigrants from Haiti that have now moved in their community. So their demographics are absolutely irrelevant. So I tell churches all the time, if you really want to know, go to your school system and ask, what's the breakdown, what's the makeup? Because they know the current reality of what that looks like. Anyway, Anglo population is 57%, Hispanic population 24%. So just kind of give you a breakdown. There's not, I mean, just if this is a sampling of the church, this is a pretty white English-speaking Anglo congregation in the midst of a community that also includes a whole lot of Hispanics, and what that looks like. So it's just a challenge, right, in matching up that profile. Then you'll see the age breakdown. This is a younger community than the national average. So there's a lot of families, a lot of children, a lot of youth. I tell every church I was working with, man, you got to have a dynamic student ministry and you got to have a dynamic children's ministry if you're going to reach this community, right? And what that looks like. The good news is you reflect the community a lot more than some churches we work with. I was just at a church a couple of weeks ago. The average age of the congregation is 72. Average age of the community is 32. You see the challenge, right? and what that looks like. So good news is you reflect the community closer than a lot of churches we work with in doing that. But it also begins to speak in to the ministry focus, things that you pay attention to, which you already have. I mean, you know, your children's area and all those things are done well. Your youth student area is done well. So you're paying attention to that, right? That's a good thing. It matches up to the profile. And then we talk about the average household income, just to give us an idea. The average household income is $112,000. Now, y'all know no one makes the average, right? Because some people make a lot more, some people make a lot less. It's just the average. It gives us an idea of indication. This is a little higher income than the national average in household. Now, it's household income. That's everybody that works in the house, right? So if you have a husband and wife that work and you got 2 kids at work, that's average household income. And what that looks like. And then the unchurched population is about 58%, which is significant. If you go back to 220,000 people, all of a sudden you get over 115,000 people that don't know Jesus within 6 miles of your church. Wow. I don't know what that does to you, man. That just breaks my heart, man. It's like, what are we doing? We got to figure this out. Now, you can't reach all of them, but you can reach some of them. Could you imagine if you just reach 1%? It would begin to change things. Could you imagine 1,000 people that are brand new? Talk about change. I'm telling you, you wouldn't be in this building. Right? It's just amazing that mission field is around. It's pretty phenomenal. Then we also want to get an idea of your current priorities compared to your preferred priorities. So we gave you 7 things. We asked you to rank them on a scale of 1 to 7, 1 being the least important, or the most important, 7 being the least important. Okay, and 7 things. Here's how you scored in your current priorities: worship, prayer, fellowship, discipleship, community service, evangelism, and missions in your current priorities. You'll notice that your current priorities lean heavily to an inward focus, caring for us. So then we wanted to get an idea, what's your preferred priorities? How'd you prefer them to be? Here's what you said: prayer, discipleship, worship, fellowship, evangelism, community service, and missions. So let me just put those side by side for just a moment so you can kind of compare what that begins to look like. This is the first time in all of the assessments that we've done that discipleship was the number 2 preferred priority, which would indicate that's probably a huge need within the church, is create a pathway for discipleship. And how do we get to that place of what that looks like? There is a desire, a little one, for evangelism to click up 1, but still not a real high priority. When we talk about prayer, discipleship, worship, fellowship, those are all us, right? It's taking care of us. And community service and the evangelism being the last 2, international missions being the final one there. Those are the outward focused ones. So there's going to be a need to do that. So part of what we try to assess is what is the perceived need to change. And we asked the question, do you think your church needs to change? And we said, do you think your church needs radical change, significant change, some change, a little tweaking, or no change at all? This began to cause concern as you talk about reaching lost and broken people and trying to figure out how to engage people, because there are a few people that would embrace significant or radical change, but the majority of people see just a couple of tweaking or no change at all. So there is the potential for resistance to change, right? And what that looks like. And so understanding the why becomes critical to introducing any what. You've got to help people understand this is why this is happening and what that looks like. And then, one of the questions we ask, you've got a transitional pastor here and an interim, and so we're going to talk about how open are you to outside help? And here's what we discovered. 8% said, we need intervention. We need assistance now. We need help soon, or help sometime in the future, or no help at all. We're good. So there is a possibility that some will embrace the transitional pastor as long as he doesn't change anything. Right? So we'll have an interim as long as he keeps doing what we like. Right? And there's that possibility of significant resistance to that change. Then it got a little confusing for us because we asked the question, how willing are you to step up and help make necessary changes? Right? So here's what we discovered. 34% said, I'll do whatever I can. 19% said, or 18% said, I'll do whatever it takes. In other words, a majority of people here said, I'll do whatever it takes or whatever I can. It got confusing because we said, how willing are you to help with the change? There are more people willing to help with the change than they are embracing the change. See how that gets a little confusing, right? And what that looks like. So it's the idea that people will help as long as they cannot change anything, right? As long as you ask me to keep things going, right? And what that looks like. Now, you do have some people that are on the edge as far as availability and commitment and all of those kind of things. And you're going to have to really teach and push hard to help people find their place in ministry, that are convinced they don't have time, they don't have energy, they're too old, they're too young, they're too whatever, right, in that process. And then we also want to get an idea of the giving capacity of the church because it's so strong. Where are you at in that process? And so we had 6% said, well, I'm willing to sacrifice financially. 17% said, I'll give generously. 46% said, I'll continue to do what I'm doing and help with special projects. 14% said, well, if it's a real need. And you had 17% said, I'm tapped out. I'm at max of what I can do right now. So there's a little bit of cushion, but not a lot. That would simply indicate that the church is nearing its giving capacity based on its current attendance. And so we just need to be aware of that as we begin to talk about the future and what that begins to look like to do that. Then if you remember, we gave you a blank piece of paper. You could write down anything you wanted to write down. We gave you no suggestions. And so we took all that, and you wrote a lot. But anyway, we walked through all of that stuff that you wrote, and our team went through it. We put it into categories, and we began to look for trends. Not everything that was written gets reported, because sometimes they're just the outliers. But we looked for the trends. In order for it to make the list, it had to be said by at least 10% of the people. Right? And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. I just want you to be aware of it when you start looking at the report. First question is, we said, what is the church doing well? What are the achievements that the church would embrace? Here's what people said. Children's ministry. Now, you'll notice it adds more than 100% because you could write down as much as you wanted. Right? You could write down 10 things if you wanted to. But we talked about children's ministry, welcoming and friendly. I told you, every church in America is welcoming and friendly. Just ask them. Seriously, we've never had a church say, we're pretty unfriendly around here. We don't like people. Right? So every church is welcoming and friendly. Just ask, because people tell them they're welcoming and friendly. What about the people that didn't stay? They're going to a welcome and friendly church down the road, just so you know, doing that. So that always makes this list. Biblical preaching, worship, student ministry, caring for one another, life groups, interim pastor, community outreach, fellowship were the things that were mentioned most often as achievements. The other side of that coin is we would ask about hindrances. What do you think's hindering the church? Hard to connect past casual friendships, no clear vision, facility and location, lack of leadership development, lack of discipleship, lack of volunteers. You'll notice there's good self-awareness based on the church health results. Spiritual gifts, leadership, structure, all those things just repeated themselves. So that's always good news. We get excited when there's good self-awareness. Because then when you start introducing the change, it begins to make sense to people because they perceive that to be hindrances. Then we said, what goals would you get excited about? If you get excited about any kind of goal, what would it be? Here's what people said. Focus on discipleship, community outreach, more small groups, helping people connect and engage, fellowship, finding the right new pastor, Bible study, and prayer emphasis were things that were mentioned most often. I find it interesting that we want to make community outreach one of the high goals for the church, but we don't really want to serve the community. It's a lower priority, right? And so we got to figure that out and what that looks like. Then we asked, well, how would you describe your church? Again, we didn't say positive or negative. We said, how would you describe the character of your church? Here's what people said. We're welcoming and friendly. Yes, we made the list again. We're loving and caring. We're lost and searching. We're Bible-based. We're authentic. Were things that were mentioned most often as those goals, or the character. Then we said, what do you think the purpose of the church is? Why does the church exist? Here's what people said. Spiritual growth, evangelism, serving the community, and loving others. I'm going to try to say this as gently, but as clear as I can. If we believe the purpose of the church is community outreach and evangelism, we have to be courageous enough to admit that what we're currently doing is not fulfilling those purposes. And if we're going to fulfill those purposes, it will require change. Doing things in a new way, in a fresh way, to do that. So then we said, okay, what would you like to change? If you could change anything, what would that be? Here's what people said. Leadership development, developing a clear vision for the future, more people involved, facility update, more fellowship, more community outreach. So there are some that understand the need to really engage. There are others that are pretty comfortable in what that looks like. So then we said, okay, if community outreach and evangelism is part of the purpose of the church, and we're open to at least talking about that and having that conversation, What's the church's reputation in the community then? How does the community view the church? Here's what people said. It's positive, or we're unknown in the community, or we're just a small church. Quite honestly, it's hard to know what your reputation is in the community unless you have conversation with community outreach and engaging people in the community and what that looks like. Then we said, what are the felt needs? What do people in your community really struggle with? Here's what you said: loneliness, school support, poverty and financial needs, a place to belong were things that were mentioned most often as the felt needs. You're going to see in the recommendations, one of the things we talk about in need-oriented evangelism, since that's a critical part of this process, is to do a community needs assessment and to walk through planning and carrying out an outreach event focused on those needs that you discover. You can't meet all needs, but every church ought to meet some, right? And what does that begin to look like? What would that look like here to really begin to engage in community engagement and outreach in doing that? So we talk about what that looks like. And then we just ask the question, this helps build your profile as you start getting into that process of search. What are the desired strengths? You can kind of read those there. These are things that people like to see in their next pastor, and certainly should inform your profile as you start building that profile. And then the last question we asked in the open-ended questions was, what keeps you in the church? What keeps you connected? People and relationships, family, a place to serve, spiritual growth, love and commitment, preaching, worship, children's ministry were things that were mentioned most often that keep us engaged in the church. And that's pretty common in what that looks like. Now, let me, as we kind of begin to land this plane, talk a little bit about first impressions. This is when Darla was here. Now, in the report, there's an entire section on facility observations. All right, I'm not going to spend time doing that tonight, because here's what we've learned. Whenever a church isn't being effective at reaching lost and broken people, they do something to their building. Because they think if they shine the fish tank up, fish will jump in. But you know, the nature of a fish is not to jump into your tank. You actually have to put them there, right? And so we never want tonight to be about facility. Is it important? Sure, but it's simply a tool to serve the mission of the church, right? It shouldn't be the end-all, care-all. We should be able to take our hands off and do whatever God asks us to do, right, in that whole process. But from a first impression, this is a guest perspective, Darla did identify a couple of things that I think were accurate now that I've been here and now that I've had a chance to walk through the facility and take a look at that. First of all, there's a basic brick facility between the fire station and the school. There is some parking, and fortunately there's more in the parking lot in the school that you can use on Sunday, or you'd be in trouble in doing that. But when you pull up to the building, it has this feel of a 1970s church that's very small and traditional. That's the feel you get. Now, when you get inside the building, it's different, but you got to get people inside the building, right? There's that bit of that dichotomy there of different visions and what that begins to look like. I've seen this building lots and lots of places all across the country, because right? I don't know, somebody must have sold the plans, but I've seen it over and over again and what that looks like. You all have done a great job inside to make it, warm and welcoming and all of those kind of things, but you got to get over the first impression, right? Which can be a bit of a challenge. The outside looks completely different than the inside. Significant renovations, creating a warm and welcoming and updated atmosphere on the inside compared to the outside of the building. Shades of gray, colorful padded seating, reclaimed wood, lanterns continue to update the worship center. This is Darla's thing. I mean, she just pays attention to this kind of stuff, and just to make sure it's warm and welcoming and all those kind of things. Several colorful, attractive, and tidy classrooms and all those kind of areas. Children's ministry. I had died for that student ministry area downstairs, man. In places I served, especially as a young youth pastor, I had a little classroom. So what a cool place. Reminded me so much of the youth group that I grew up in. We had an attic. It wasn't a basement, but it was an attic with the same kind of feel to it. And I thought, man, what a great place. And the children's area is the same way. I mean, man, how cool is that? I can tell you, if you can get people in the building, it's very clear that children and youth are valued. But you got to get them in the building, which can be the bit of the challenge, right, in doing that. Now, let me talk a little bit about Sunday morning. Again, this is one Sunday. So, if there's something here and you say, well, that's not the way it is all the time. It's just one Sunday. Get one chance to make a first impression. And this is Darla's observation. There were no greeters until just about 10 minutes before the service that Sunday. People gathered in the lobby in the worship center to visit, enjoy coffee upon arrival, and seemed to really connect, get along with one another. Volunteers were in the nursery, the kids' classrooms to greet kids. I wish I could tell you how many times we go to churches that have lights on, but nobody's home. They have Sunday school classrooms, they have nurseries, lights are on, but there's no volunteers. There's nobody there ready for the kids to come. That wasn't the case here. Talk about the worship service. Now, you may not know this, but Darla is a worship leader by call and passion. So she's been a worship leader at large churches all over the country. And so she looks at things a little different than when I do these assessments. I look for more of the feel. She looks more for the technical stuff and what that looks like. So just observations from that Sunday morning. There was a quality video with photos for services and events on the screen with appropriate music before the service. Countdown in the lower corner seemed to work well. Volunteer signed in the kids on the iPad, but there were no instructions for any guests that happened to be there. So if I'm a guest, how do I sign in? What does that look like? All those kind of things. Again, the worst thing you're going to hear in the church is, well, it's just us. We know what to do. Or it's good enough for us. Right? We're not talking about us. We're talking about guests, right? From that perspective. The service time started with a warm greeting and a passionate singing, executed well. The screen's a bit small, but the lyrics provided well and kept up, which is one of the things you don't hear Darla say very much, because a lot of times they lag behind, but that wasn't the case here. During the music and the sermon, people sang and were engaged and responsive, which just adds to the whole flavor of the worship for guests. Volunteers prepared for excellent worship and learning for the children, and so it was just one of the things that we do when we're here. We go down to the worship center where the children are, just kind of get a sense for what that looks like, and so it was pretty exciting what she got to see that day. There was no security observed during the service. Doors were unlocked throughout the building. No one posted in the lobby or children's hallway in case of emergencies. If I'd had to say security would have to be an issue, 25 years ago, I'd have never said it. But, man, it is a key issue now. And not only it speaks volumes to guests that you care enough about my children to make sure they're safe, right? So that people aren't going to sneak in here or God forbid, that there would be a parental fight and somebody coming in and try to steal kids and all those kind of things, but to provide that security. And I always tell churches, it's good to have security visible in the children's area for the parents' sake, because it communicates that you really do pay attention to that in doing that thing. So now the other thing is the live stream was done on YouTube. Professional slideshow with music prior to the start was a good touch. Music, leadership, sound, and tech announcements all executed with quality. Adding or turning up a mic to hear the congregation would be a positive addition. If all you hear is what's up front, you forget that there's a congregation that's actually worshiping together. Providing that kind of sound was just one of those suggestions. Now, let me talk a little bit about website. This is my thing, because the new front door of the church is your online presence. So people will always Google you before they ever show up on your property. This is a chance to tell your story. This is a chance to get the word out that what people are going to experience on the inside may be a little different than the outside, right? How do you tell that story and what that looks like? So that's what we did. There's a website that's attractive and informative, but quite honestly is difficult to find with the .faith ending. There's a lot of WatersEdge Church around, and if you Google, this isn't the first one that comes up. You have to search for it. You have to figure out where it's at. All of those kind of things can be a real challenge. The only reason we found it is because we went to your Facebook page, which there are several WatersEdge churches on Facebook too, but went to your Facebook page to find your website address. So Google optimization is really important so people can find you easily and what that looks like. There's a Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube links available on the website that take you to those areas. Social media use. The church's Facebook page has 470 followers. It's used mostly to share encouraging verses and quotes, advertising coming events, and a worship service every once in a while. Now it seems to be a little more consistent than it was as far as showing up. Now, you all know Facebook is great. if you want to reach people 55 and over. That's the fastest growing demographic on Facebook. 55 over and women. If you get younger, it begins to be other things, whether it's Instagram or whether it's Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, these days, or whether it's TikTok or whatever it might be that people are using to tell story. Instagram page has 124 followers. Same use as Facebook. It's mostly inspirational quotes that are in the Instagram piece. The YouTube channel has 190 subscribers, primarily used to share the recordings of the sermons only. So it's one of the tricky parts. If you go to your YouTube, you can hear the sermons, but you won't hear the worship service because it's the sermons that are recorded. Yeah, that's copyright issues and all those kind of things, but there's licensing for that as well to do. When people go to your website or go to your channels or go to your social media, they're trying to figure out your story. Not so much the content. They want to know, will I fit in there? Will I look like them? Right? And what that looks like. So the online presence is the new front door. It's ever changing. It's ever challenging. How do you communicate with the new generation? I have 2 daughters that if I ever send them an email, I have to text them and tell them I sent them an email because they just don't use email like I did, like I do in that process. I have a 20-year-old grandson that lives with us. If I texted him something, his phone is not with him half the time. But I'm going to tell you, if I need to get a hold of him, I have a Discord account. For you that are gamers or kids that are gamers, Discord is a gaming communication arm that gamers use. He has a Discord account. If I send him a Discord message, I get an instant response all the time because that's where he hangs out. And he and I game together because I just like to be aware of what he's playing and who he's talking to and all those kind of things that are part of that. At 20, he gets a little more resistant to that, but still lives with us. So anyway, in doing that. But it is always a challenge, right? How to communicate with a changing generation and what that looks like. All right, here's the good news. You ready? When you get the report, you can now skip the first 25 pages and go to page 26. All right? Now, unless you're melancholy. If you're melancholy, you will start at page 1 because that's the only way you know how to read a book, right, in doing that. Now, if you're choleric, you can go ahead and skip the first 34 pages and go to page 35. That's where the recommendations are. That's really all you care about anyway, right, and getting that report. But as I said, we believe it's important for you to hear the why so that the what begins to make sense. So what I want to do is just hit on the highlights of the recommendations over the next 5 minutes. All right, I'm just going to hit the highlights of what that looks like, and then we'll wrap things up as we do that. All right, so you're going to see in the recommendations, there are some recommendations around certain areas of the report. The first area is what we call leadership. Now, when it comes to leadership, we believe it's critically important that you establish an implementation team to begin to work on the recommendations. We don't want to add that to an already busy schedule for the elders. That needs to be an implementation team that's balanced in leadership style, personality, and spiritual gifts. Right? So that implementation team, they will be appointed, nominated by your interim pastor, appointed by the elders, and commissioned before the congregation. Because we want everybody to be aware of who's on that team. But that team will take these recommendations and put ministry teams together to begin to implement. So you're going to see in the recommendations the establishment of some ministry teams to help implement the recommendations in certain categories. All right, so that leadership team, nominated by, appointed, and commissioned before the congregation, will be and given the responsibility to take the recommendations and put individual fingerprints from your local church, right, based on your culture, based on who you are in that process. And then the second area that we believe is critically important to this whole process is spiritual renewal. We believe prayer doesn't prepare us for greater works, it is the greater work. So everything that happens must come first from the heart of God. So spiritual renewal is critical. So the establishment of a prayer team that is given the responsibility to lead the church in seeking the heart of God in fresh and new ways during this time of transition. where there'll be times of corporate prayer, individual prayer times. There'll be opportunities for you to gather together to worship and pray together. This isn't something we do, it's something we are. And that spiritual renewal piece becomes critical. We need to hear from the heart of God before we determine the what's. The third area of recommendation is the area of the church health things. So all the things we talked about in church health. So we talk about this idea of establishing a leadership team. We call it the engagement team. You can call it whatever you like. But the establishment of an engagement team that simply focuses on how to engage people in the ministry life of the church. How do we empower people more effectively? How do we make sure people understand and know and released according to their gifts, passions, and call? How do we help people get plugged in to the right areas? And how do we help them unplug from the areas they're not gifted, called, and passionate about? Right? So that's the engagement team to do that. Then we recommend a structures team, which will help review the structures, put together some ministry descriptions, making sure everybody understands the role, responsibilities in that structure. Some vision conversations you'll see that are outlined there as well, and talking about the future and where you all see yourselves going in those conversations. And then we talk about the need-oriented evangelism team. We call this the outreach team, but with a focus on doing a community needs assessment, and we'll provide some resources and tools for doing that community needs assessment, and then designing at least one outreach event during the interim focused on engaging lost and broken people in the community based on that needs assessment, right, in that process. So we do a community needs assessment, say, okay, here's a need that we have the ability to reach. Let's figure out a way to do that. Let's figure out whether it's a program, whether it's an event or an activity, whatever that might look like to do that. All right, so that's the outreach team in doing that. And then the next area is in the area of first impressions. Again, we're just talking about doing a review to make sure the building, the parking, the signage, the online presence, all of those things are guest friendly. And more importantly, tell your story well, right? And what that looks like. Because every time a guest shows up at your website, they want to know, will I fit there? They want to know, do I look like the people that are in that room? They want to know the dress code. Because every church has a dress code. We don't have a dress code. You can come as you are. That's not true. I'm just telling you right now, you don't want me to come as I am sometimes, and we'd all be embarrassed in that whole process, right, in doing that. So we all have a dress expectation, right, in doing that. So people want to know, will I fit? Because when our guest shows up at your church, they already have some level of anxiety. And what you want to do is lessen that anxiety as much as you can. You won't get rid of it, but to lessen it. Do I know what building or door to go in? Do I know where the restrooms are at? Do I know where the meeting room is at? All of those kind of things play a critical, important part. If it were me, I'd be designing some guest parking out here so that people know where to start, and I'd have greeters and ushers that were focused on anybody that parked there to make sure I engaged them in conversation when they came in. Right? It's just the idea of being guest sensitive in that process. So that's the first impressions. And then the last set of recommendations in the area of communication and celebration. I mentioned at the very beginning that one of the things we want to do is make sure you all are aware and you have opportunity to speak in to this whole report and the recommendations. So one of the things that we're recommending is that you communicate to the best of your ability. That may be town hall meetings, it may be some stuff on the website, it may be printed material, it may be text messages, whatever way it is, to let everybody know what we're doing and why we're doing it, so that nobody's surprised. The second part of that communication is celebration. Because what we've learned is nothing builds positive momentum to the future than celebrating what God is doing. There's something contagious when we begin to rejoice and celebrate at what God does. When people step up, we're going to celebrate. When that team is selected, we're going to celebrate. When that team begins to work and establish the ministry teams, we're going to celebrate those ministry teams. It's the idea of celebration. It builds positive momentum. If you've ever been to a sporting event, you know what that's like. When people start cheering, all of a sudden people play differently, they act differently, they do things differently. Things that you never thought they could, they do in that process. It's just a matter of celebration. Because there's no greater miracle than when God speaks into people's hearts and they step up and step in, and when lives are transformed. It's better than any home run or touchdown in that process. I'm an avid baseball fan, have been all my life. I'm a Detroit Tigers fan, have been all my life. My wife is a diehard Cubs fan. She has been all of her life. You don't care, nor do you know, but in 1984, the San Diego Padres played the Chicago Cubs in the National League Championship. The Detroit Tigers were the American League champions. Detroit Tigers played the San Diego Padres in the World Series. I was pastoring just outside of Detroit in 1984. I had a guy in my church that had season tickets. He 2 rows from the dugout, right behind Sparky Anderson's wife. Sparky Anderson was the manager of the Detroit Tigers at the time. His wife sat 1 row in front of us. I got to see 37 games that year. I was there for the last game of the World Series. It was on a Sunday afternoon. I preached the shortest message I've ever preached on Sunday morning so I could get down to the ball game. And I'm sitting there with a couple people from the church and going through the game and anxious and all of those things. And Kurt Gibson came up and hit a home run to seal the deal. And I'll never forget. I didn't go, well, that's kind of nice. Man, I'm high-fiving people, hugging people I don't know. I'm celebrating a home run. I'm thinking to myself, shouldn't we as the body of Christ be able to celebrate when a life's transformed? When somebody steps up and steps in, when people begin to get involved in the ministry life of the church in new and fresh ways, we got to just rejoice and celebrate. You say, why is that important? Well, we're just trying to get you ready for heaven. I don't know what heaven's going to be like, but I do know that Luke chapter 15 says there's more rejoicing in all of heaven over the one lost sheep that is found than the 99 that don't need to be found. All of heaven rejoices. So listen, if you're in heaven and Jesus hasn't come back yet and there's still evangelism happening in the world, every time a lost sheep is found, all of heaven rejoices. So if you don't like partying now, man, you are not going to like heaven. It's going to be miserable for you, right? Because all of heaven rejoices. And so we got to just learn to rejoice here. You know, we are people of hope that's been given a message of hope to a world that desperately needs hope. Sometimes I want to tell Christians, man, tell your face you're hopeful. Because, you know, I'm around some Christians, and man, all they do is frown and grouch and complain. And I'm thinking, why would I ever want to be like that? Right? We're people of hope with a message of hope. Man, no matter how bad things get, we're people of hope. Jesus is still Lord of Lords, King of Kings. It's still the Holy Spirit that empowers us and enables us to live the life He's called us to live. So let's just go ahead and be the church to reach a lost and broken world. Now through the church, the manifold wisdom of God is to be made known. God, help us to be more effective. Help us to be healthier, so that our message is magnified and not muted by our stuff. Give us the courage to say yes when you speak, even if it makes us uncomfortable, even if it takes us places we've never been before. Amen? Let me pray with you. Father, thank you for your church. Thank you for allowing us to be a part of it. Thank you for this incredible message of mission and vision that you've given to us to be your hands and feet to a lost and broken world. So I pray today that you give us the ability to discern your will, to live fully into the passions that you've put in us, and that we would courageously obey all that you would reveal. Grant, I pray, blessing upon this church. There's so much good in the foundation. Now help us to build on that foundation in healthy ways so that we might help the population of heaven increase and bring hope into the lives of those around us. And Father, for all that you do, we'll give you the praise, the glory, and the honor. For it's in your name that we pray. Amen. Amen. Hey, God bless you. Thanks for being here tonight. I appreciate it.